Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the ethical treatment of animals. Our guest is John Berkman, a professor of moral theology at Regis College in Toronto. Unfortunately, Mary Eberstadt is unable to join us today. I'm your moderator, Phil Cerrone, an associate ethicist at the NCBC. Sarah Czar, the NCBC's membership director, will help moderate questions at the end of the panel. Human beings' treatment of non-human animals has long been recognized by the Church as an aspect of our stewardship of nature. Although its significance has been re-emphasized in recent years, especially during the papacy of Francis, the Church arguably does not have a uniform approach to this relationship. Today, Dr. Berkman will discuss some perspectives on animal ethics from Church Fathers and magisterial documents such as the Catechism, as well as more recent attempts to synthesize Catholic teaching in a single framework. John, thank you very much for joining us today.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start with just a little bit of context with kind of the thought of Aristotle and Aquinas and pre-Vatican II kind of statements from the moral manuals about the treatment of animals.
Right. So certainly historically in Aristotle and Aquinas, human beings, one of the first things to recognize is that human beings are in fact animals. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa, when he wants to give an example of a self-evident proposition, the one he uses repeatedly is a human being is an animal. And one of the things, but of course, it's a special kind of animal, and he defines it, a human being, as a rational animal. And that understanding of rationality in Thomas is something that gives human beings, in fact, one notion of dignity, and also, in fact, an immortal soul, because for Thomas, to have an immortal soul, there has to be some immaterial aspect of the human being. And this is, in fact, for Thomas, the way he thinks about what is the immaterial aspect of human beings. In the moral manuals, one of the things that it emphasizes is, or many of them do, not all of them, but many of them do, is the wrongfulness of cruelty to animals. Now, typically, this is expressed as instrumentally, that such cruelty will also lead to cruelty to human beings. But there also is a sense that other creatures and God's creation also have a certain dignity, and one should not cause harm needlessly to others of God's creatures. But interestingly, Thomas, in the Summa, he refers to animals, other non-human animals, I should say, repeatedly, but his interest is not in that work, not about other species. Interest in that species is primarily about God and God's relationship with human beings and how human beings return to God. So interestingly, most of the times he's referring to other species, or particularly animals, higher animals, as he would say. He's giving a contrast between them and human beings. In the same way, on the other side, he repeatedly gives contrasts between human beings and angels. So I think when one reading Thomas, one has to recognize that context, that in most of his references, he's out to distinguish human beings from any other species, whether it be lower species in terms of other embodied species, or higher disembodied or non-bodied species such as each angel.
All right, thanks a lot, John, for that background. So a lot of the magisterial teaching regarding animals is found in 4 paragraphs in the Catechism, correct?
Yes, although I confess I don't have them in front of me right
Okay.
now. I can get them if you want, but I don't
Yeah,
have them.
well, if you can just discuss a little bit of, what the substance of those four paragraphs are,
Right.
and yeah, just a little bit about that element of church
I may need
papacy.
to go grab them so I don't say something. Do you want me to go actually grab them and discuss them from the text themselves? Because I just don't want to mislead.
The first one is paragraph 24:15, and it says, "The seventh commandment enjoins respect for the integrity of creation. Animals, like plants and inanimate beings, are by nature destined for the common good of past, present, and future humanity. Use of the mineral, vegetable, and animal resources of the universe cannot be divorced from the respect for moral imperatives. Man's dominion over inanimate and other living beings is granted by the Creator, but is not absolute. It is limited by concern for the quality of life of his neighbor, including generations to come. It requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation."
Right. So on this first one of the fundamental questions we need to begin by thinking about is what constitutes the integrity of creation. One of the, I think, most profound discussions of what doesn't function as the integrity of creation is when Pope Benedict speaks about the way geese are treated to make foie gras. He says, this is terrible. It turns these creatures into caricatures of creatures, or the language might even be stronger than that. And he sees this as clearly incompatible with what it means to respect the dignity of each creature. And certainly in Pope Francis, he clearly thinks that all creatures have their own ends, and by flourishing according to their ends, in the same way that humans are called to flourish according to their ends, both natural and supernatural, each creature gives glory to God. And we might go back to Aquinas on this, that, as he says, the perfection of the universe requires the whole diversity of creation, all of which, through their flourishing, give glory to God and praise God. This particular section of the Catechism seems to emphasize that all other creatures are of only instrumental good, although it pulls back from that in saying, well, it's not absolute. One can't do anything one wants with the rest of creation. Therefore, I think to understand this properly, one has to, as it says in the last part of the last sentence, it requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation, which I think up until Laudato Si was not worked out very extensively. And I think Laudato Si very much lays out a framework of what this religious respect for the integrity of creation might be.
Thank you very much, John. And I think we're going to get into that framework a little bit later on when we're talking about Laudato Si. The second paragraph, 24:16, states, "Animals are God's creatures. He surrounds them with his providential care. By their mere existence, they bless him and give him glory. Thus, men owe kindness to them. We should recall the gentleness with which saints like St. Francis of Assisi or St. Philip Neri treated animals."
It seems to me that this section, while not necessarily in conflict with the previous one, certainly has a very different emphasis. In the previous one, recall that it talks about man's dominion over other living beings. It says is limited by a concern for the quality of life of his neighbor. So again, that seems to be what human beings owe to animals is simply what you owe to another human being. But here the emphasis is on the goodness of other species in themselves. As it says, their mere existence, they bless God and give God glory. And thus, it says we owe other animals kindness. And then gives the examples to follow, such as St. Francis and St. Philip Neri. And I think here's the emphasis as it begins that animals are God's creatures. They are also created by God, and as creatures of God, they owe to God praise. Now, other species give praise to God in different ways. And as I've said, I believe other species give praise to God by their flourishing according to their individual natures. And that's why I think what I was referring to Pope Benedict earlier, why he thought certain kinds of treatment of animals is so awful, because it denies their creaturehood.
All right, moving along to the third paragraph. God entrusted animals to the stewardship of those he created in his own image. Hence, it is legitimate to use animals for food and clothing. They may be domesticated to help man in his work and leisure. Medical and scientific experimentation on animals is a morally acceptable practice if it remains within reasonable limits and contributes to caring for or saving human lives.
Let me start by talking about domestication. I think sometimes there's arguments that other species are not to be domesticated simply for human beings. But in fact, I think the history of the evolution of human beings shows that human beings historically were able to survive and thrive because they entered into symbiotic relationship with other species. And that in many ways, the history of human beings can't be told without understanding their relationship to other species. I think some of them have been obviously very good. Others perhaps have involved abuse of other species. But one of the things I think that's really interesting is that there is an argument that Homo sapiens survived and Neanderthals did not survive because Homo sapiens began to hunt with domesticated wolves, with dogs, which made their hunting far more efficient. And this symbiotic relationship, which was mutually beneficial for both species, we can thank for our continued existence as a species, if that argument is to be believed. The other thing I think that's important in thinking about this question is that, yes, clearly throughout the history of humanity, in most cultures, and today in many cultures, human beings simply could not survive without using other animals for food. And in those contexts, where such survival and thriving is necessary, yes, then human beings must use other animals for food. However, I think in light of the scriptural accounts of our fall, the enmity between humans and other creatures, in fact, is a result of the fall. And though certain effects of the fall require us, some peoples today and most peoples in the past, to have used animals for food, I believe that if we can return to living at peace, as we did in our prelapsarian state, and I think as shown by saints, again, such as St. Francis and St. Philip Neri, if we are able to live at peace with other species, then we should seek to do so.
Great, thanks a lot, John. That was very helpful. And now on to the last paragraph of the Catechism before we move on to talking about some things written more recently by popes, is paragraph 2418. It is contrary to human dignity to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly. It is likewise unworthy to spend money on them that should, as a priority, go to the relief of human misery. One can love animals, one should not direct to them the affection due only to persons.
There are certainly examples of human beings who use truly inordinate resources on their non-human animal companions or pets. And I think this is a kind of perverse relationship. You can get quotes from the amount of money Americans spend on the pet industry, and it's enormous. However, the same is true, and perhaps even more problematic, for the vast amounts of money Americans spend on all kinds of things that they don't need, which it would be much better for that money to go to the relief of human misery. And so while certainly I don't think human beings should spend inordinate sums of money on caring for non-human animals, I think that is in fact a higher priority to be concerned for other of God's creatures who we have so often treated so badly and abused so badly, as opposed to the huge amounts of money we waste on luxury goods and all kinds of things that we don't need, that I think are less important than our concern for other creatures that God has put on this earth and who God wishes worship from, these other species, in light of their being able to flourish. So to the extent that we have done things to prevent other species from flourishing, I think we owe injustice to spend the resources to overcome the wrongs we have done and allow other species to flourish as God wishes them to do. Having said all that, there are certainly ways in which we spend resources on all kinds of things, including non-human animals that we shouldn't. And that, I think, particularly in a massively consumer culture in which we live, needs to be thought about much more deeply.
John, I'm happy you brought up that idea of vast amounts of money and consumer culture, because that goes right into the next thing that we were going to talk about, which is John Paul II talking about structures of sin, especially a consumerist mindset. And, I'm not sure whether this, what extent it plays into the in principle, say, duties owed to animals, and how much it deals on the, how we treat animals is instrumental to how we deal with other people. But it seems like both of those elements are wrapped up in this idea that regardless of where you fall on the animal ethics spectrum, that consumerism is a harmful orientation.
Yes. And that, I suppose, is one of the deep problems of our living in a wealthy, affluent society, that we easily take for granted all kinds of things, or assume we ought to have all kinds of things that we don't need. We're constantly bombarded by advertising telling us we need certain things we don't. And not only that, we just need them, that we deserve them. And in fact, we're doing something wrong if we don't give them to ourselves. And this, I think, I'm not saying anything, I think that's not obvious, that this is really, I think, corrupting of us in terms of how we ought to orient our desires in our lives. And in fact, I think one of the best ways that we can overcome consumerism is to reflect more on and attend more to the relationships in our lives. I think so often, so much of consumerism is an attempt to fill a void in our lives that ought to be filled by our love of God, our love of neighbor, and our love of other creatures. And so, in fact, I think it may be one of the best ways to overcome this consumerism is to attend more to strengthening and deepening our relationship with other persons, but also with other of God's creatures, and to care for them, and also to care for the earth, to come to understand God's creation, whether by gardening or through trying to recover certain habitats that have been destroyed, usually for commercial gain.
Excellent, excellent. So now I think we're finally getting to Laudato Si. You had talked earlier about how this encyclical seems to make a leap forward in kind of collating and interpreting our relationship with animals. So what is that framework that Pope Francis posits?
Right. Well, I think a central theme in Laudato Si, a phrase that is like a mantra throughout that document, is some variation of everything is connected. That we cannot bifurcate our relationships with humans from and how we care for them and love them, but how we also appropriately care for and love other animals, and how we appropriately care for and love God's creation more generally. That if we are destructive in our relationship with one, we will likely be destructive in our relationship with others. And if we care for one, we'll be more likely to care for the others. That is obviously a huge generalization of one theme in Laudato Si. But clearly, Francis wants to have an integrated view. He's very opposed to those who say, well, we need to recover the integrity of land and the environment, therefore we need to get rid of human beings. He's equally opposed to that as he's opposed to the reckless destruction and polluting of the created order that he argues against so strongly. I think one of the most interesting themes that comes up repeatedly, but is never discussed directly, is what his claim that there is intrinsic goodness in every species that needs to be respected. In the same way, phrases in the Catechism, like the integrity of creation, are not necessarily worked out very extensively there. I think similarly, Francis hasn't worked out extensively what it might mean to recognize the intrinsic goodness of every species. And that's a question I've been very interested in for the last 15 years or so, perhaps longer, is thinking about what it means to appropriately care for or love other species. And therefore, what I'm very interested in is what I've called a theological ethology. Ethology being the discipline in which we come to understand the nature and practices or behavior of other species. Or I call it ethotheology, where part of the theological task becomes to understand what it means for each species to flourish, both in relationship to the kind of practices and capacities and habitat required for various species to flourish. And in some sense, to try to learn how to treat each species as God would want each species to be treated in terms of the created order we've been given and what it might mean for each species to be able to exercise the capacities that God has given us and by which it glorifies God. Now, these questions are, of course, further complicated by the fact that we live in a fallen world and that no species, including ourselves, are automatically or easily able to flourish in the way God intends. Human beings were struck down either by disease or by predators or by oppression from other people and so forth and so on. And so we see much of the human population around the world is in many ways prevented by flourishing from oppression from other people, from being victims of war, from economic exploitation, by being trafficked, human trafficking, and the list goes on and on about the way many human beings in this world are not able to flourish as God intends. And I think this is even more so with regard to most of the other species with whom we share our common home, as Laudato Si refers to it. And what therefore an ethotheology does is try to ask the question, how may we assist other species to the extent that we're capable of doing so, within recognizing the limits imposed by our fallen world and so forth, to either assist other species in flourishing or perhaps more appropriately trying not to do the things that hinders them from flourishing. And to do so, we of course need to know a lot about each individual species and how it flourishes and how we may at least try to stop doing the kinds of things that prevents such species from flourishing.
All right, John, you bring up a lot of very interesting points about, assisting rather than hindering flourishing, et cetera. So before we get into questions, let's get into some kind of practical examples of, you have on the one end, church teaching that you can't be cruel to animals.
Right.
And on the other end, we also have, an affirmation in the Catechism that, well, you can still eat them, you can still use them for food, you can still treat them instrumentally. So what are some practical ways of using these ethotheology principles to address practical situations and find that virtuous balance?
Right. So first of all, I would say, let's talk about eating. That's the practice, perhaps that impacts our daily life more than anything else. It is clearly not intrinsically wrong to eat other species. As a result of the fall through much of human history, the only way for human beings to survive would require them to eat other animals. I was once having a conversation with a very well-known animal rights advocate, and I might say I'm not an advocate of animal rights. I think the language of rights is deeply problematic in all kinds of ways. A guy by the name of Tom Reagan. And I remember talking to him and saying, well, what about the Inuit in Canada's north, used to be known as Eskimos? And his answer was, well, they should all move south. Which I take it was a completely, well, I won't go into what I thought of that, but I disagreed with it. And clearly around the world, there are people who need to eat other animals, and it can't be avoided. However, in our wealthy, affluent Western culture, we have no need to eat other animals. The very significant part of the population, or at least to kill animals for food, are able to live very happy, healthy lives without eating non-human animals. Even gigantic athletes like football players, linemen, many of them have become vegetarians or even vegans. So the argument that somehow if we don't eat other animals, we won't get all the nutrients we need is just false. There may be a tiny percent of the population that require certain enzymes because of medical difficulties that might be required, but overwhelmingly we don't need to. But even more importantly than that, the one clear thing about our relationship with animals that's wrong is cruelty to animals. Our society hates certain kinds of cruelties. One might remember a little over a decade ago, a certain football player was convicted of running a dog fighting business and treating probably 40, 50, 60 dogs in cruel ways. And he was sent to prison for a significant period of time for doing that. This was in the state of Virginia. And yet within 50 miles of where this football player was running this dog fighting business involving about 50 dogs, there was a gigantic corporation treating equally or more cruelly millions of pigs and making huge sums of money by factory farming them, which is clearly a form of institutionalized cruelty. And so whatever else one may think, the one thing I think we're obliged to do is not cooperate with this institutionalized cruelty towards animals that we see in factory farming in North America and in Britain, and it's begun in Europe, and it's basically also being this model is being exported in many parts of the world. And as Benedict would say, this is a pure instrumentalization of God's creatures. Somewhere in the realm of 96, 97% of chickens are factory farmed. Somewhere, I think around 85, 90% of pigs, maybe 80% of cattle. And so the only norm I would say is that if we're going to eat other animals, we need to make sure we're not eating factory farmed animals. So I think that's the one norm I would say to avoid the obvious prohibition in the Catechism of cruelty to animals. One of the problems is we don't see this very much because Congress has passed laws that makes it a crime to say photograph or make videos of what goes on factory farms or in slaughterhouses or in other places where this animal cruelty is so widely practiced. But it's not hard to learn about it. It's not hard to read about it. And I think most people who think about it and read about it and understand what goes on, not only the incredible cruelty to other animals, but also typically the way this also negatively affects those who work in such places, and usually work in such places because they really don't have any alternatives for jobs. This is, of course, why these slaughterhouse and factory farms are typically have a very high percentage of undocumented workers or other workers where it's one of the only jobs they can get, and nobody who has a choice in the matter wants to work in such places. So I think are taking seriously this question of animal cruelty, as we as a society have practiced it and continue to practice it, and at least try to stop that, is, I think, the one imperative for thinking about what we do or what we eat.
I thank you, John. We're going to get into some questions here at the end. And just a reminder to everybody listening, there's still time. Send your questions to Sarah if you have any. The first one is actually really interesting. And, it asks, if we are part of the animal kingdom, that
Right.
would seem to affirm the doctrine of total depravity. But how does this, how is this different than the Catholic doctrine of original sin? And so I guess it's kind of, how does one reconcile the idea that, if we're animals as part of the animal kingdom, how do we not have to accept this idea of total depravity, and how can you reconcile that with original sin?
That's an interesting question. I'm curious what conception the person asking the question has about other species, or which particular species they're thinking of. They're probably thinking of the relatively small percentage of species that are predators on other animals, that are carnivores. But I take it the vast majority of species are, in fact, non-carnivores or herbivores or vegetarians. I think, in fact, other animals, or those who we might be able to ascribe moral responsibility for some acts to, which is very controversial. Many people, including many animal advocates, think that we shouldn't ascribe moral responsibility to any other species. But I think there's arguments to be made based on an understanding of certain species. But the reality is that no other species commits or could even possibly consider committing many of the sins and many of the wicked things that we as human beings can do. And let me give an interesting example. In Shakespeare, there are kind of, and following Thomas Aquinas, there's some sins of the body which are more shameful, like those to do with our eating, with our appetites, our sexual appetites, and so forth. And then there are sins which Thomas, and following him, you see in Shakespeare, sins that are more serious, like pride, like avarice, things that really destroy our souls. Now, I'm not saying that sins of the body can't, but if you, for example, in Shakespeare, the ones who commit these more shameful sins, but less serious sins, as Thomas would say, it doesn't mean they're not mortal sins, but they're less serious. In Shakespeare, those characters are typically the buffoons, those people laugh at. Whereas nobody laughs at King Lear. Nobody laughs about Lady Macbeth. The true villains are the characters that are committing sins that only human beings can commit, so to speak. And so I don't think that the rest of the animal kingdom is completely depraved. Arguably, if they can't commit sins, they're not depraved at all. In fact, I believe C.S. Lewis thought this was one of the reasons, an argument for why you should think about animals in the kingdom of heaven, because unlike human beings, they don't commit sins. They don't alienate themselves from God. But be that as it may, yeah, I simply don't think that other species are totally depraved.
All right, thanks a lot, John. I appreciate that. So as a second question, how does an evaluation of animal flourishing help us determine what is due to an animal or how we should interact with them? For example, are there some animals that are better able to flourish by living among humans and therefore make good pets? Similarly, are there some animals whose flourishing is not affected as much by isolation and interventions that are part of medical experiments? So, for example, are there characteristics of murine flourishing beyond their biosimilarity to humans that indicate that they're good research subjects?
What species would make good research subjects? I missed that.
Oh, that mice. Is there something about the flourishing of mice that, beyond the fact of their biosimilarity, that indicates that in an integrated way, it's, maybe to some extent proper for them to be research subjects or something like that?
Right. So let me start with questions around domestication. Some very interesting studies have shown that there's certainly a variety of species that, if an effort is made, can be domesticated extraordinarily quickly. There is an experiment done starting in the 50s in Russia where they tried to see if I believe it was silver foxes or minks. They simply selected those species that were in those individuals that were in cages that weren't either very aggressive or very fearful of human beings. And they bred them, and within about 3 generations, they showed serious signs of domestication. Their bodies changed, their legs got shorter, their tails different, their morphology changed, and their behavior changed. And in about 8 generations, these silver foxes were entirely domesticated. They actually barked, they wagged their tails, they would follow humans around. You can watch videos of like 75-year-old ladies with one of these foxes sitting in their lap like a cat. And so, in fact, there are clearly species other than those that we think of or that have become relatively domesticated, like dogs or cats, that also could become domesticated. Whether they should be domesticated is another question. Whether it's actually beneficial to that species at all to be domesticated is another question. So in evolution, I think you see, and it's not even just between humans and other species, you see all kinds of examples of symbiosis between different species. Certain birds that clean the backs of boars or other birds that clean the teeth of crocodiles. And clearly there's a symbiotic relationship between them that benefits both species. Now, is there a species that its flourishing is increased by being instrumentalized for animal experimentation? I can't think of why or how it would benefit a species. What I would say is that the kind of captivity and the kind of manipulation necessary for use in animal experimentation, it's less problematic the more that captivity detracts from its flourishing. So clearly, the use of chimpanzees, I think, is particularly awful because of the multitude of ways in which their flourishing is almost entirely eliminated in such situations. I think you could say the same about other more complex species, the use of dogs in experimentation, or a variety of other more intelligent creatures. I take it there's some species which arguably their range of flourishing is more limited, and therefore the way it is limited by using them in experimentations would be less morally problematic. But I still would say that that pure instrumentalization, I think, of such species is not treating them in a way that allows them to flourish as God created them to flourish.
Our next question, our next two, I think are very grounded, very, very day to day. The first one comes from somebody here in Pennsylvania. They say, what do we do with things like spotted lanternflies, which has been named an invasive species, and we are called to kill them on sight? How do we show stewardship for that species while recognizing the devastation they are causing to plants and crops?
You want me to just take up that one before the next one, or which I can do? I'm happy to do.
Yeah, it was
Okay,
it was
sure.
all put as one question, but
Right, that's fine. That's fine. I think this is one of the really difficult and very sad situations, because in almost all of these cases, the reason you have these invasive species is because what humans have done. In most cases, they've been imported through commercial trade, which now is so global. And this is one of the huge downsides of globalization and free trade, is that you are bringing species that can live in relative harmony or equilibrium in one habitat, whereas when they come to another one, they don't. And in some sense, such a species, well, you could put it in Catholic casuistry by thinking that an invasive species is, in one sense, attacking other species, and the principle of self-defense, or the defense of, on behalf of those other species that are going to be destroyed by this particular species, justifies one in killing them. In the same way, it might be very tragic if a human being under some terrible mental illness or other situation in which they have no control over will kill you unless you defend yourself and ward them off, which often may involve their death, although we can never intend the person's death. And so there is, I think, an analogy. I haven't thought about it this way before, but I think there is an analogy in that principle of legitimate self-defense being applied to ecosystems. Although, in some sense, it's very unfortunate because it's not like that particular species, again, got there on its own, or at least in the vast majority of cases, or we can attribute any wrongdoing to the species.
So as you've been talking, we've been getting in a couple questions on a similar topic, but changing it a little bit.
Right.
So, how would you then practice stewardship for species that aren't invasive, that are in their natural habitat, but are causing problems? Like some of the examples are bees or wasps or snakes that compromise human health. Or if you have a barn and you have mice in there, getting a cat to eat the mice. How do these principles play into that kind of situation?
Right. So I think they're both individual questions, but also structural questions. Like, how did it come to be that that particular species is invasive? Like, a coyote taking a sheep on some grazing land. I mean, if human beings have taken over much of the habitat of these species, in a lot of cases, it's not giving them much of an option in terms of finding food for their own survival. And I think so often these situations arrive because of human taking over, destruction of habitat, etc. I mean, if you live in a city, if suddenly they tear down a house, 3 doors down, you can bet, in a couple of months, all the mice that might have been living hidden in the foundations of that house are going to be moving into the houses next to them, and they'll see an uptick in them. It's like when their habitat is destroyed, they have to go somewhere else. I think to the extent possible, certainly with bees, which we have a huge need for, and because of various human activities, their populations are declining precipitously, which, even if we don't care about the bees, is terrible for all kinds of agriculture and cross-pollination and so forth. I think, again, that principle of self-defense could apply in some cases. I think when possible, you should simply try to move the creatures to somewhere where they're not disruptive, rather than simply killing them when that's possible. And I think also recognition, that if we are taking over and destroying their habitat, we do have some responsibility to try to make sure they still have alternative habitats, or they have alternative means of survival and flourishing, without simply seeing them as pests. Because of course, pests just means that they're inconvenient to us. Nothing, there's no species per se that is a pest. Or a weed would be the equivalent in the plant world. That's simply a term for saying they're doing things that we don't like or that are inconvenient to us in this particular context. For one person's weed may be another person's beautiful plant, one person's pest may be another person's pet, or et cetera, et cetera.
All right, John, one last question. And this is one of the participants would like you to elaborate on how we can think about animal research models of serious human disease or disorders. This person finds it hard to imagine that a mouse designed to have a serious genetic disease would be flourishing as a mouse.
Right. Well, this will certainly get into questions beyond which I'm competent to speak about. But I think one of the first principles is our models, our research that does not involve the instrumentalization of other animals, have those been exhausted? And to what extent is the research using the animals absolutely necessary? Are there alternatives? Have they been pursued? I think there are cases where you are talking about research, very serious and very significant research. I'm not competent to say whether there are alternatives or not. But I also think it's important to recognize that an awful lot of research and basic research, those doing it actually don't know what they're going to find or if they're going to find anything. And other times, I think a lot of this research is for relatively trivial purposes in terms of what really improves human flourishing. And so I'm certainly not going to rule it out in any situations, but I certainly think if those engaged in it took seriously other species as God's creatures who deserve to flourish, I expect there would be much, much, much less experimentation on animals.